So what are we here to talk about, I suppose, is the first thing. So this session is predominantly about the governance and behaviour aspects of public bodies climate change reporting. There's been a lot of focus on the kind of data side of reporting and less focus on the governance and behaviour side, which covers climate action and planning. So that's what we're going to focus on today. To do that, we're going to run through a few slides. So we'll start with why do we have the climate change duties in the first place? Some of the basics that you need to know to be able to put those duties into effect. Why it's important to have those two aspects of reporting. So in addition to the data side of it, the planning and actions side of it as well. And then we're going to talk about how to make a plan, some suggested actions, common barriers that are affecting public bodies, barriers to climate action. And then I'm just going to slip in a quick little brief tour of our website, and then we'll have questions. Okay, so why do we have climate change duties? Primarily because we are in a climate emergency. That emergency was recognised in Tynwald several years ago and led to us having our Climate Change Act, and that's where those duties come from. So that was a reaction to the global issue that had been identified. To put a bit of context around it, there are a lot of other jurisdictions that have very similar legislative provisions around public bodies and how they should contribute towards climate action. So Scotland in particular has almost identical provisions. So if we don't start making changes quickly and consistently to reduce our emissions, the impacts of climate change are going to get worse. Everyone has a part to play. So no matter how large an organisation you may be representing, right down to the individual, businesses, third sector organisations, everybody has a part to play. The public sector should lead by example. So we are the ones who are kind of setting the tone, and we're also setting regulation and policy for the Manx public and Manx businesses. So it's really important that we lead by example and sort of walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And the last point to make is that having those climate change duties on a legislative footing provides a clear shared goal and shared principles for the whole of the Manx public sector, so that we're all pulling in the same direction and we can all support each other. Even though we have very diverse functions as public bodies, we do have these shared goals that we should be able to support each other to deliver. So the main driver for those duties is to drive public sector climate action. That's the real, when we really boil it down, that's what it comes to. So what do I mean when I say climate action? So reducing emissions and increasing carbon storage in line with the fair change principles. I'm going to touch on the fair change principles a little bit later. I realise that might be a new term to some of you. But yeah, so essentially we're reducing emissions and increasing carbon storage in line with those guiding principles. This slide is really to illustrate, the reasons behind why we're doing this and why we need to reduce emissions. Climate change is no longer a kind of long-term future threat. It's happening right now and it's happening here. So the pictures that you can see on the screen, 4 of those pictures are from the Isle of Man. 1 of them is from the UK, the rest are from the rest of the world, and they are all things that happened in 2022. Most of them are record-breaking events. So the worst drought on record, worst floods on record, worst wildfires on record. So it really goes to show how urgent this is and how relevant it is to what we're doing today. The headlines that are sort of tagged underneath them also give an indication of the knock-on financial impacts of these disasters. So it isn't just about, you know, the immediate loss of life and the injuries that are incurred, and it's after that, the damage that happens, you know, and sort of supply chain disruption, and the impact that it has on people's lives can go way beyond just the actual incident itself. So it's just really to kind of illustrate where we are with that, is that it's happening now and it's happening here and everywhere. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the science in this session. I think everybody, or most people, have a basic understanding of, you know, what is climate change and how it happens. But what I wanted to do was talk about a little bit of the terminology that is commonly used, which may be less familiar to people. So firstly, I wanted to talk about the term GHGs. So GHGs just means greenhouse gases, and that is, you'll hear a lot of people talk about carbon and carbon footprints, but carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide is one of the main ones, but there's also methane. There's also fluorinated greenhouse gases that are used in things like air conditioning and refrigeration. But what happens is, as an umbrella term, people tend to use carbon to describe the whole the whole range of greenhouse gases that we monitor and that contribute to climate change. The other thing to sort of note is that the different gases have different what's called global warming potentials. So it's basically about how strong an effect they have, how strong that greenhouse effect is from each of the gases. So as an example, 1 molecule of methane has the same warming effect as 28 molecules of carbon dioxide. So this can get quite complicated when we're talking about all different gases. So generally what's done in reporting at a national level is that you talk about all the greenhouse gases as carbon dioxide equivalent. So you're aligning them all up with carbon so that you can talk about them all at the same time. So just to kind of draw attention to the fact that if we say carbon, we don't usually mean just carbon. We mean the whole range of greenhouse gases. So wanted to talk about the scopes. This is something that appears in our guidance, and it's common to the way that people talk about emissions and reporting. And it's a useful tool for thinking about your emission sources when you start to look at that. So scope 1 is your direct emissions. Essentially, it's things you burn. Well, it also includes agricultural and forestry emissions. So you might think of things like the burping cow. The burping cow trope is quite a popular one, but essentially those scope 1s are direct. They're in your control. They're to do with the fuel that you're using to power your vehicles, the fuel that you're burning to heat your buildings. So they're direct emissions, scope 1. Scope 2 is purchased electricity. So while you are not necessarily actually burning a fuel to generate your electricity directly, you'll be purchasing it from the national network. The use of electricity creates demand for that electricity to be generated. So it's an indirect relationship, but it's still something that you have influence over, and your behaviours and the way you use electricity can change the demand for that. Scope 3 is everything else that's kind of an indirect influence. So it's things like the supply chain for goods that you might purchase. So when you buy a physical object, that physical object has come from raw materials, it's been manufactured, it's been transported, it's been packaged. All of those actions until that object arrives to you and you use it, they all have an emissions footprint. It's very difficult to tie down exactly what that emissions footprint is, but there are some general kind of rules that you can use to try and improve that, even if you don't know exactly what it is. Excuse me. So the other thing is outsourced activities. So if you have contractors, you don't have direct control over their emissions, but you're creating the demand for the work that they're doing. You know, you're asking them to do work which they would not do otherwise. So it's something to think about. Another part of scope 3 is waste disposal. So anything that you throw away, that's part of the life cycle of that item, and its disposal also contributes to its life cycle carbon footprint. Commuting and business travel, again, it's not something you may have direct control over, as in you don't own the plane, for example, that's taking someone to a meeting, but you're creating the demand for that. And finally, investments. So that is things where you potentially are invested in businesses that contribute emissions globally. So that's just a quick rundown of the different scopes. And I'll just move on to... Okay, so I mentioned fair change earlier, I think on the first slide. We have... so the public bodies' climate change duties are made up of emissions reduction and contributing towards reaching our national targets. But alongside that, there are these 4 principles and that have been designed so that we can deliver the change that's needed to reach net zero and our other targets in a way that maximises benefit and minimises harm. So the example that I like to use is that if we were only focused on reducing emissions at any cost, we could, for example, just switch off the power station. But instantly, everybody would realise that's not a good idea. There would be loss of life, loss of earnings. You know, it's not a good outcome, but it would reduce emissions significantly, instantly. So we have to make sure that what we're doing is reducing emissions in a way that supports our economy, our community, and our environment. And these 4 principles are the way that that is reflected in the climate change duties. So you've got just transition, and that's all about the kind of economic sustainability. So it's about access to jobs and opportunities, and making sure that we make changes in a way that it helps our economy to flourish. Climate justice is more about the social equity side of things. So the way that that's defined is it's an acknowledgement that those who have done the least to cause climate change are the worst affected by it, and the least able to deal with those impacts as well. And that's true locally and globally. So, you know, globally, obviously, there are developing countries who are experiencing very, very severe climate impacts, and actually their emissions are very, very low. You know, locally, you've got the poorer end of, you know, people with lower household incomes generally have lower emissions than people with higher incomes, and yet the changes that they need to make, you know, it's more difficult for them to make them because of that. Biodiversity and ecosystems is around the environmental protection side. So that's to do with really making sure that the ecosystems we have are healthy and can provide us with the services that we rely on. And those really are essential services for human survival. So clean air, water, soil health, pollination, that's just a really small kind of example list there. But it's really, really critical. So those 3 aspects, the economic, social, and environmental, are described as the 3 pillars of sustainability. Essentially, those are the 3 areas that we need to take care of to ensure human survival, longevity, quality of life. And if we're not looking after all 3, you know, the other 2 will suffer, whichever, you know, sort of vice versa. So sustainable development, the last one, is a kind of umbrella for those. And it directs us towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which then give us more detail. It's broken down into 17 goals, and that can give you more detail and understanding about how to apply those principles to the work that you're doing, because it goes into a lot more detail. At the bottom of that slide, I've got a question about what would transition look like without fair change. So that goes back to that the sort of hypothetical turning off the power station example that I gave. So, you know, that analogy works on lots of levels. So it's really important that when we're making change, that we're taking into account these principles, and that we're not solving one problem and exacerbating another problem at the same time. Okay, so I said at the beginning of the presentation that we were going to sort of talk more about the governance and behaviour than the data side of things. So this slide is about why it's really important to have both of those sort of categories included in reporting. The governance and behaviour side of things is, oh, sorry, excuse me. So sections 1 to 5 give examples of why it's really beneficial to have that governance and behaviour reporting, and 6 to 8 down the right hand side tell us what some of the drawbacks are if we didn't have it. So emissions data alone can be limited in what it can tell us. Number 6 there is that emissions data doesn't capture the fair change principles. It doesn't capture scope 3 emissions. It doesn't capture small scale land use change or external policy changes that might influence the way that people in wider community might behave. So if we're just relying on consumption data for the public body, it's quite an inward looking way of doing it. It's really very, it's limited to what the public body is doing with its own assets. But the role of the public sector, like I said earlier, is that we are involved in setting policy. We are involved in kind of shaping the behaviours of the community and of businesses. So a lot of the changes that we can and should be making would not be reflected if we were just looking at our own consumption data. Hold on. Yeah, so small scale land use change, this came up in the session yesterday. I just want to touch on that really briefly. Land use change, so we're talking there about carbon storage, so tree planting, for example. The way of measuring carbon sequestration, if you want to do it accurately, it involves quite a lot of information gathering and possibly an ecologist, and you have to look at the health of the habitat. So the reporting that we are asking for does not look at that in much detail. It provides a very basic indicator for parcels of 1 hectare or more, which is quite large. So the question yesterday came up that the feeling was that small scale tree planting, for example, would be missed. And actually, that's where the governance and behaviour side comes into it. So we're capturing those small scale changes that we might not be able to capture them accurately with the data, but actually the qualitative description of what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the impact that it's having is so important. So we do want to see those actions, no matter how small scale they are. So the governance and behaviour section of the report enables you to have those kinds of actions recognised. The other issue with just emissions data alone is that it can fluctuate regardless of the effort that we might be putting in. So, for example, aviation emissions dropped considerably during COVID. And that wasn't because somebody decided that they wanted to reduce aviation emissions. It was just a symptom of the travel restrictions. So sometimes emissions can change, despite what we're trying to achieve. They can go up, they can go down, and it may not be to do with actions that we've taken. So on their own, they don't tell the whole picture. So that's why it's really important to have the qualitative data, those plans, descriptions of actions that you've taken, that will give us that whole view of what's going on. The note about scope 2s going up is to do with the fact that as more and more we are changing to electric technology, so electric vehicles and air source heat pumps, for example, your scope 2 emissions, which is your purchased electricity, that is likely to go up. So just focusing on emissions reduction, again, doesn't tell the whole picture. But if we understand why they've gone up, and we've got the data to go along with that and see that things are moving in the right direction, then it paints a much better and complete picture. So I'm happy to go into any more of those in more detail later, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on. And I'll also provide these slides. I'll put them on the website for people to look at afterwards. Okay, so how to make a plan. So even the smallest of public bodies can make a plan. The smaller public bodies plans will be simpler, I'm sure, because they'll have less diverse emission sources. But even an individual can make a plan, for your own household. You may not do it formally and actually write it down, but you can think about what your emissions are and how to reduce them. So the first stage is emissions. Identify your emission sources. We have lots of resources on our website to help you do that, and there's lots of things online as well. So for on a personal level, there's the WWF carbon footprint calculator, which is really helpful, and there's a lot of information you can get from the government, UK government's SME resources, and they've got a carbon footprint calculator for small, and I think it's SME, small and medium sized enterprises. So you don't necessarily need the data. So you don't need to know how much, for example, your electricity bill is to know what kind of actions will make it go down. So I know in my house, without looking at my bill, that I should be turning lights off when I'm not in rooms and things like that. So it can be incredibly helpful to have that data, and we are really keen to get everybody much more engaged with their data, because it does help to drive change. But waiting for that data doesn't necessarily mean you have to stop and do nothing until you have it. There are things that you will be able to know, that you'll know are going to make a difference without having that data. So while data is really important and can be really helpful, lack of it shouldn't hold you back from starting to take action. So what can you control and what can you influence? So some of this kind of ties in a little bit with those the emission scopes. Some things will be in your direct control, some things won't. We're not asking any public body to change something that it is not in its gift to change. So while you're looking at your emission sources, at the same time, consider which ones do you control and which ones you can influence. So there may be something that you may be in a rented building, for example, so you don't control the type of insulation that's in that building, but you might be able to influence that by getting in touch with your landlord. So it's about thinking about how much control and how much influence you can have on those emission sources. And there may well be some that you don't have any control over whatsoever. So this leads into that next stage, which is finding hotspots. So this is looking at those emission sources and figuring out, well, which actions are low cost or no cost, which actions have the highest benefit, which are the easiest to achieve, and using that process to prioritize them. So there may be higher cost actions that have really, really high benefit, but that you can't do right now, whereas there's low cost that have lower benefit, but you can put them into effect really, really quickly and easily. So it will be different for every public body, but that's part of the process that you should be going through to make your plan. Consider fair change. So we have a document called the Fair Change Framework, which forms part of the statutory guidance for public bodies. And that framework gives you guidance on how how to engage with your stakeholders and your service users to kind of develop actions and policies in a way that that maximizes benefit and minimizes harm. So just want to really encourage everybody to check that document out. It's on our website as well. Set SMART objectives, that's quite self-explanatory. Make and share your plan. So sharing your plan both with your staff and with your stakeholders is important, because you can maximize buy-in, you can get your colleagues involved as much as possible, not just in delivering the plan, but also in coming up with ideas, things that you haven't thought of. And also the sharing it more widely increases accountability, and kind of drives you on and shows to your stakeholders that you're forward thinking and committed to tackling climate change. And finally, monitor and report. So having a plan is really, really key to being able to continually improve and see how we're getting on, what things worked, what things didn't, and being able to improve, year on year. Suggested actions. This is a difficult one because the public bodies are such a hugely diverse range of organisations, and they're diverse in their functions, they're diverse in their sizes, locations, all in every way. They're very, very, very different, from the very largest to the very smallest. So coming up with suggested actions is quite challenging because it's really going to depend on the public body themselves. So what I've tried to do here is just do some very basic kind of low cost, no cost actions that I think will apply to everybody, and also some money saving actions which generally should apply or could apply to any of the public bodies. And these really are around the first three, the no cost, low cost, they're really around that governance and behaviour aspect. So it's about ensuring those duties are embedded in your decision making processes, in your existing policies, and updating those if you need to, making sure your staff are aware of climate change, making sure that they're aware of the duties, and just raising that level of interest so that not only are they thinking about how they can reduce emissions at work, but also how they can reduce their own emissions. The point about decision-making processes is really, really key, because what we want is for all of the decisions that a public body is making to contribute towards those shared goals. So you don't want to be kind of reducing emissions with one hand or with one decision and then increasing them with another decision, because you're just going to be shooting yourself in the foot, really. So just making sure that all of your decisions are taking those principles into account and working together. The money saving measures. So undertake building energy efficiency measures. And a lot of the time, public bodies have said to us, well, we don't control the building that we occupy. So that's okay. There are still things that you can do within your organisation that would be behavioural changes rather than physical or structural changes to the building. So it's about how you use energy, how you use your appliances, the kind of appliances you purchase, that you can still put into effect even if you don't control the building itself. So the next one is reducing the need for travel. There's a few things that you can do about that, and these should be within your power to do. So putting in place internal policies, for example, about holding meetings online by default. Making for business travel, you can have a policy to default to boat and rail instead of flying. Or have that as the first choice, rather than first choice being flying. Reducing emissions from data storage. There is a info sheet on our website all about how you can do that, with information kindly supplied by GTS. So you can help with that. That's something I think that every public body will use some form of data storage. So anything that you can, anything of these that you can do, if you're saving energy or you're saving fuel, you're saving money. So it's all for the positive, really. And the final one is about reducing consumption and waste. So again, if you're reducing the amount of things that you are buying, that's a saving as well. So some simple tips on that about avoiding disposables, about reusing things you already have, and considering that waste hierarchy of reduce, reuse, recycle in that order. Recycle being kind of the last option, because at first the first option you want to do is reduce what you're buying in the first place. Then you want to keep what you've bought in use for as long as possible and just retain its value as long as possible before you finally dispose of it. So, and all of that will, you know, if keeping the value in the things that you purchase and keeping them in use longer also saves money as well. So this is a slide about some of the barriers that we have heard about very frequently. So they're quite kind of high level, not specific, and how we might look at those. So the first one at the top of the screen is one that I'm sure you will all be familiar with, is we don't have enough budget. So this is a very common a common barrier. And what we would suggest is prioritising those actions that are going to save money. So energy efficient behaviours, reducing consumption, that kind of thing. We understand that there are some big ticket items that people want to purchase, for example, changing fleets to EVs, changing buildings to air source heat pumps. You know, it may not be possible to do all of those things right now, and we understand that. There is a quote from the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees of warming about the system transitions that are needed being unprecedented in terms of scale, but not necessarily in terms of speed. And that's the thing, is that we are not asking everybody to change everything this second. You know, what we would like to see is public bodies planning for the future. So, for example, vehicles, heating systems, all those big ticket things, at some point those systems will come to the end of their natural life. You know, if you can replace them before that, okay, but if you can't, it's about planning for that time and putting in what you need to put in place now to make sure that when that opportunity arises, you can take it. So we're not asking everybody to get everything done like this year. It's about starting with the low cost, no cost actions, and moving ahead at a steady pace. You know, there is a sense of urgency, of course there is, but don't feel immobilized and avoid doing the small things because you can't do the big things immediately. It's really important that we don't skip over all of those small things waiting to get the big things done. So we don't control the buildings we use. I've touched on this earlier. Yeah, it's true. Some of you don't control the buildings that you use. It may be, as I mentioned, the case that you can influence how those building, changes to those buildings. But what's really important is that you, again, don't get distracted by things you can't change or things you can't achieve right now. Concentrate on trying to find the things that you can do and start moving, and it's the sort of start moving steadily and don't be immobilized by what you can't do and kind of thinking too much about that. We don't have enough time is the next one. So this is where making a plan really comes into its own. Sometimes time can actually be an advantage, like when you're scheduling changes in line with when things were going to be replaced anyway. So that's going to give you more time to find the funding, for example, for that change. So it's all that process of looking at your emission sources, finding your hotspots. That's going to be looking at what can you achieve now, and if you can't achieve it now, when can you achieve it, and how can you use the time in between to enable that to happen when you want it to. So we don't have enough staff resource. So an important point to make here is that The way that the climate change duties are written, it's all about the way that public bodies undertake their functions. So we're not asking you to wildly change what you do as a public body. You still have your usual responsibilities to deliver the services that you usually do. What we want you to do is really embed the climate change duties into what you're already doing. So that's why I've written there, consider how you do things before considering doing new things. So look at your existing processes, look at your existing policies, and see if there's a way that they can be tweaked and tailored so that they better align with those climate change duties. Our public body is too small to make a difference, has nothing to do with climate change. Well, I've mentioned this, I think, several times. Everyone has a part to play. So fossil fuels and other high emitting practices are absolutely ubiquitous in our modern lifestyles. So the changes that we are going to need to make as a society are going to touch everybody. And that's why every single public body has a part to play. And it's about looking at your public body and what it does, and thinking about what is your role in our transition to net zero. And like I said before, we're not asking you to radically change what you're doing. We don't expect I don't know, public bodies with no land or anything to do with trees to suddenly start planting forests. Look at what you do as a public body. What are your functions? What are the services you provide? And what can be your unique role in that transition to net zero? How can you as a public body reduce your emissions? But how can you also support the rest of the island and our community to reduce their emissions as well through the services you provide? So I don't believe in climate change. So as I mentioned earlier, the climate change emergency is acknowledged in Tynwald, and we have legislation that sets out, the government's approach on climate change. But actually, you don't need to believe in climate change to be able to see that the benefits of what's being proposed are really clear. So the changes that, if we move away from fossil fuels, as a kind of bonus, you get cleaner air. If we protect our environment better, you're going to get cleaner water. We're going to have better well-being and health. Active travel, being active reduces the risk of so many diseases. That the changes that we're proposing, even if you took emissions out of the equation, would still be beneficial. So really, you don't need to believe in climate change to be able to get behind the transition to net zero. So the last one, I don't know where to start. So what I'm going to do is move off this. Sorry, I just need to come out of this and go onto our website and share it with you. This is the netzero.im website, which is run by the Climate Change Transformation team. There is if you go up into the top right-hand corner, there is a special area just for public bodies. It's open to the public as well, in case they're interested. So on that page, you've got lots of resources. There's a quick kind of guide to the duties all on one page there. You've got information sheets about the different aspects. If I just click into one, you'll see these are single page documents with kind of accessible, to make it a bit more accessible than the big guidance document. If we go down a bit more, you've got all the relevant legislation, some information about funding, and then a bit further down you've got some documents that have been put together. So there is the public bodies reporting form. That's what you'll use to submit your report. There's also a document that larger public bodies can use to collect data within, from different teams within their organisation. So thank you to Beverly Graham from the Cabinet Office, who came up with the template for that. And just here is the climate action plan template for small public bodies. So the principles of putting a climate action plan together are the same no matter the size of the public body. The reason this is kind of aimed at small public bodies is because larger ones, it's likely to be a slightly more complicated process. They may get a professional audit done. You know, but by all means, larger public bodies, please do check that out, because it does help and give suggestions on how to go about putting a plan together. Down at the bottom, you've got FAQs. So we're happy to add to those. If anybody has questions and the answers aren't there, please do let us know, and we're happy to add to that. And this area of the website is under ongoing development to try and sort of make sure that everything is there to help public bodies. The rest of the website, there's lots of information on things like energy saving, you know, which is all useful too. So that was just really to highlight where you can get some of those resources from. So I'm going to stop sharing, and would anybody like to ask any questions?
Got a question, Chris Pycroft, Douglas Council. Just looking at the reporting form, this is the first time I've seen it, so I just noticed in the first section about transport, it just seems to be petrol, diesel and coal. We don't use any coal, I don't think. But I know on the calculator that we use at the moment, we've got gas oil as well that we have for some of our plant, which I think is agricultural diesel.
Yeah, so what we've done, I think there's a note on the side of that one, because there's also marine diesel as well, but
Okay.
the conversion factors are very similar. So to keep it as simple as possible, I think if you just put that under diesel.
Right. Okay.
My question is access to funding, centralised funding. So for things that are island-wide, and I'll give you an example, the crematorium is an example. Looking at plans in the future of redeveloping how we provide the energy to the crematorium, would funding be available?
So what I'm going to do is ask Ali if she will give the same answer that she gave yesterday to this question, just because she's much more directly connected with that work stream. Ali, are you all right to come in?
Yeah. Sorry, Linda, where are you from?
I'm from Douglasborough.
Yeah, okay. So we had Ramsey asking the same question yesterday. Essentially, we've been having ongoing discussions with Treasury for the last sort of 6 months or so. They have progressed quite well. It's taken a little bit of time, but they've progressed quite well, and Treasury are now more amenable to they're more open to accepting that local authorities will need some funding to assist with climate action. So where we are at the moment is that they have showed that they would be open to that suggestion. They have asked us to work with a sponsoring department to help figure out how that might work. So what the process would be, who would manage the business cases, what was in scope, what's out of scope, those sorts of things. So that is currently happening. We're at the very early stages of figuring out how it might work. And then I guess once we figure out how it could work, we'll need to propose that formally to Treasury so that they can confirm that they're happy with it. But it is good progress that we have managed to get this far, because it wasn't always the answer that we got when we were asking. So if you bear with us, we'll try and figure out a process and see how we can make it happen, essentially. Yesterday, I just took a note of everyone's emails from local authorities who were interested in funding submissions and promised to keep them up to date. So I think that's probably the best thing to do for you, Linda.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I'm glad progress is being made.
I just want to thank you all for coming. It's an amazing turnout, and I hope it's been useful. If you've got any feedback on the session, please do drop me an email. We hope to hold more sessions like this in the future. For example, a bit more detail on those fair change principles and how you might be able to implement those in the work that you do. But yeah, if you've got any suggestions for sessions that you'd like to see, or additional content on the website, please do let us know. We've got a dedicated email address for public bodies. It's just publicbodiesclimate@gov.im. So that's all one word, publicbodiesclimate@gov.im. So yeah, thank you so much everybody for coming, and I'll see you soon.